Merci beaucoup pour l'opportunité de présenter aujourd'hui. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you everyone who stuck around for this last presentation on a Friday afternoon. So from 2013 through to 2016, I photographed Canadian artist studios. I traveled across the country. I photographed 124 studios, and I'm still working a little bit on this project now that things have opened up a bit. So my main focus for this project was to try and take a portrait of the artist through their studio space. So when the project started out, my main focus was on the space, and I didn't include the artists in the photograph. I really wanted the creative process to be visible. And from one end of the sort of all the way from the idea stage all the way through to the finished product. So the focus of this project was mainly on painters and sculptors studios, since they're really the artists whose everything kind of takes place in their studio. I really found that the sort of studio space is a window into who they are, why they create, and how they do it. This work was exhibited at the Art Gallery Hamilton in 2017, and also a book was published by Black Dog Publishing in 2017 as well. So the first studio that I visited for this project was Kim Dorland's studio. I was quite surprised when Kim accepted my request, since I didn't have any images to show him. But he was very willing, which I was very grateful for. And so for this photograph, I showed up. It was just after the Christmas break, and I got to talking to Kim, and he said, yeah, they just sort of cleaned up the studio space. So I realized at that point that I didn't want the photographs to be posed, and I didn't want for the artist to have just cleaned up for me when I show up. So I asked him if I could come back at a later date and took this photograph, which ended up being the final photo. And yeah, so that was I realized that early on, that there was this desire, or sort of this need by artists to make the space look clean or a certain way. Same sort of thing happened at Shelley Adler's studio. I realized after taking the photographs that she'd put out a lot of paintings, finished paintings to sort of be on display. So I asked her to go back a second time as well, and sort of asked if I could be there when there was a piece painting in progress, so that I could capture some of that creative process from her work. This is Kent Monkman's studio, 2014, his studio in Toronto. So Kent's one of the few artists that I photographed who has a whole team of assistants working for him. So you can see there's several workstations set up. I think he had three sort of underpainter assistant stations set up, and then Kent's station is back on the left, where he sort of gets the paintings after the assistants have done all sort of laid everything out, and he sort of puts the finishing touches on the paintings. So for the first 2 years of the project, I was mainly based in Ontario, and I think I photographed about 20 studios during that time. In 2015, I got a small grant from the Ontario Arts Council, as well as some help from Aeroplan, and they gave me some points so I could travel a bit more easily. And so my first trip outside of Ontario was to Montreal, and this is Pierre Dorian's studio in Montreal, and it's in his house, top level of his house, or top floor of his house. And people, one of the most common questions I get with this photograph is what is in the floor. So that's just a pretty simple explanation. Because he has the skylight above, he put another skylight in the floor so that the light could also get down to the level below, which ended up being his bedroom. One thing I really loved about the studio and the way the photograph turned out was the studio space really feels like one of Pierre's paintings. Just the reflective of the subject matter that he puts into his paintings, very sort of minimalist and simple. Valérie Blas's studio, also in Montreal. Really loved visiting her studio. She's just a really great artist, and really loved how there was so much of her process visible in this area of the studio. So from the little maquettes working up all the way to a more finished product. And Valérie is also one of the artists who works with assistants. And then, as we saw, a wonderful film by Zoé the other day at Claude Toussaint's studio. I loved sort of all of the circular and square shapes that are kind of found everywhere in his studio space, not only in the paintings, but also in the paint containers and clocks and all of the other objects that he keeps around. Harold Glender's studio. Harold has two studios, one in Ontario, one in Montreal. So this is his Montreal studio. Nicolas Lachance, also Montreal. I was quite interested in Nicolas' work. I hadn't seen it before I got to his studio, this new body of work that he was working on, but oddly enough, there was quite a connection to work that I'd done. Before becoming a photographer, an artist, I had studied science. So this is what's called a Western blot, used in science to figure out types of proteins and that sort of thing. So I was quite interested how similar the artwork was that he was interested or working on, and its connection to science. As Janet Werner's studio. So when I visited Janet's studio, I told her, because it takes me a long time, I was working with a 4x5 camera. So really, I'd generally be at artist studios for about 2 hours. And a lot of that time was just finding the composition, kind of walking around the studio, figuring out, where I could capture an image from. And so Janet was working away in the studio. And as I set up the camera, she was working where she is now. And, she kind of was part of the composition as I was setting the image up. And when I went to take the final exposure, I asked her to leave so that I could do the final exposure. And I realized at that point that it seemed like it was missing something. So I invited Janet to come back in and do what she was doing. And also realized at that point that, I quite liked how she worked in the composition. I wanted to avoid making the artist front and center, posed in front of their paintings kind of thing, like a lot of work that's been done in the past. So, and I really found also Janet such, she puts there's so much of herself in the portraits that she paints that I thought this was quite an interesting moment, the way it turned out. Mélanie Autier in Ottawa. Mary Pratt's studio in Newfoundland. So this studio was built in her house. And one of the comments I often get about the photograph of her studio is that people are surprised at how small it is. And I guess part of that is just the stature that she has in the Canadian art world. Or in the art world in general, and people sort of expect her studio to be much, much bigger, but it was, it was bigger than what's showing here. I'm just showing a portion of it, but, it wasn't an immense studio, but it also kind of makes sense with the size of work that she generally works on, smaller artworks. The Christopher Pratt studio, also in Newfoundland, out in rural Newfoundland. And just, interesting moment with the milk crate that's down in the bottom right-hand corner of the photograph, kind of matching the colors that he uses often in his paintings. And, I really found those moments quite interesting where artists really surround themselves with things that consciously or subconsciously work their way into their artwork. Sarah McCullough's studio in Nova Scotia, Wolfville, and same sort of thing here where Sarah uses a green palette in most of her paintings. And just, I loved how the light coming through the window was also that greenish light. So, you know, she's sort of surrounding herself with the light that she loves. Same thing here in Mario Doucet's studio. Reddish color that he's painted the walls, and he's putting the same reddish color on the jackets of all the soldiers in his painting. Tony Sherman's studio in Toronto. Really interesting studio visit with Tony. He had the TV blasting on CNN the whole time. He's sort of really connected to news and the outside world. And he, in the bottom left of the photograph, you can see all the printouts that he's taken from the internet to use as a source material for the paintings. And then also he's got 4 or 5 stations set up with encaustic. So he's heating up all these plates. Even though I was there in February, it was incredibly hot in his studio. Wanda Coop in Winnipeg. I was lucky with my timing when I went to Winnipeg for Wanda's. She just sort of completed, or was towards the end of this major body of work on her trip to New York. This is Isla Burns' studio from Alberta, and really kind of amazed at the way she works. She doesn't have any assistants. You know, she was over 60 years old at the time when I came, and she was wheeling around all of the welding machinery and metal and doing all the work by herself in her studio. Joe Fafard out in Saskatchewan. Same sort of thing happened here with this composition as did with Janet Werner. And Joe was just working in a studio, working on some sketches and in his notepad. And I realized as I set up the composition that I really liked the way he looked just like the sculpture on the right-hand side of the composition, which I thought at the time was actually a sculpture of him, a self-portrait, but it's a sculpture of his father. So quite an interesting that he's in there in the same position that his father was in the sculpture. Evan Penny's studio in Toronto. Evan works with distortions in his sculptures, and you know, this one that he's working on was first printed on a 3D printer, and then he goes in and works to smooth it out and get it looking the way he wants. Etienne Zach, at this point, he was living out near Vancouver. I found it really interesting, the sort of the tiling that was happening, and you know, with all the papers laid out on the floor of the studio, and similar to what's happening in his paintings. This is Robert Davidson's studio out in south of Vancouver. Really quite an amazing space. You know, he's a senior artist and is able to custom build a studio to his specifications, and it's quite interesting, just sort of similarities that he's incorporated in there to his Haida ancestry, and similarities to sort of being in a longhouse. Quite a beautiful space, and you know, interesting to see how he works and creates. Several assistants were helping him that day as well. So there's sort of three different workstations set up to work on his sculptures. This is Gathy Falk's studio out in Vancouver. Sort of beautiful light, which was you know, sort of permeating all of the artworks that she was working on at the time. Quite impressive. She was in her 90s when I was there, and all the works on the back wall, sort of to the right-hand side and to the right-hand side of the studio, had all been painted that year. So she's still quite prolific. This is Joseph Tesiga's studio up in the Yukon in Whitehorse. And Joseph set up an outdoor, basically car tent that you can buy at Canadian Tire or places like that, so that he could work outside during the warmer months. And he was sort of completing this body of work at the time. This is Tim Pitsiulak up in Kingate or Cape Dorset. So he worked opposite from Shuvina Ashuna. The way it worked up there in the cooperative is the two senior artists in the community were given studio space in the co-op where they could work. And so I chose to include them in the compositions as they were working, partly because it wasn't, because it was a shared space and not their own personal space. There sort of wasn't as much personal ephemera around for them. And I also just love the way they worked in the compositions. So I'll leave it there for today. Thank you very much.